Section 50 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 32. The old Duke of Umbria was dying. He lay clothed, as he had once said to Inglesant, in the Angelica Vestis, the sacred wafer in his mouth. Below, in the palace chapel in the great Duomo, in Rome itself, masses were being said day by day, and the ineffable host raised to heaven in intercessory prayer for this man's soul. If any deserved an unruffled passage over the dark river, he did. He had sought long and earnestly to find a more excellent way, and had shrunk from no effort nor painful mortification if he might at last walk in it when found. He had resigned himself and all that he possessed in implicit obedience to the doctrine and the see of Rome. He had crowned a blameless and beneficent life by acts of unparalleled devotion and piety. Nevertheless, an unruffled passage he did not have. The future was dark and full of dread, and he suffered all the terrors of the grave with a troubled mind. Lying thus in dull misery of body, and in mental apprehension and unrest, he bethought himself of Inglesant. Having surrendered himself, soul and body, into the hands of those who stood about his bed, he knew that it was useless to let his mind wander after any of those unauthorized teachers from whom in past days he had sought instruction. But in Inglesant he had for the first time met a man who, walking to all appearance in the straightest paths of the Catholic Church, seemed to possess a freedom of spirit greater than the sectaries themselves could boast. Even when suffering the rebukes of an accusing conscience and the bewilderment of a disordered brain, there was in Inglesant an unfettered possession of the things of this life, and even of the life to come, which had astonished the old man, who, unaccused by his own conscience, was yet so confined and hampered in this world, and in such continual dread of that other, which was shortly to be revealed to him. He expressed to his director a wish that Inglesant might be sent for. It was impossible to deny him this request, even had it been thought desirable. Inglesant was a trusted confidant of the dominant society of Rome, a favourite of the new pope, and had besides been influential, as was believed, in obtaining that crowning triumph, the cession of the duchy to the papal see. A messenger was therefore dispatched to Rome requesting his immediate presence. The summons found him with Loretta and her father, engaged in preparations for his speedy marriage. This connection was regarded with great favour by Don Agostino and most of his friends, but was looked upon, as far as they condescended to notice it at all, with suspicion by the heads of the Jesuit Society. They were beginning to dread the influence of Molinos, and Inglesant had already incurred some suspicion by his intimacy with the Spaniard. The Pope was supposed to be not altogether opposed to the new doctrine, and the Jesuits were unwilling to lose an obedient servant who might be useful to them. There was, however, no sufficient reason in this why he should be forbidden to visit the old Duke, who was certainly dying, and therefore beyond the reach of dangerous influence, and Inglesant, remembering the interest he had felt in the Duke and the favours which he had lavished upon him, hastened to set out. When he arrived in Umbria, he found the Duke had rallied a little, and he received him with the warmest expression of delight. He was never content save when he was in the room, and his very presence seemed to restore strength and life to the exhausted old man. Those who watched about his bed in the interests of Rome, if they had felt any apprehensions of the result of Inglesant's visit, were speedily reassured. for the Duke did not seem desirous of conversing upon religious matters with him, and indeed rather avoided them. He seemed to cling to Inglesant as to the only remaining link to that world which he was so soon to leave, and to take a strange pleasure in furnishing him with those appliances of earthly enjoyment which had until now long ceased to be of interest to himself. Among other gifts, he insisted on his accepting a suit of superb armour, which had been made expressly for his idolized son. In this suit, in which he caused Inglesant to be arrayed, he declared that he well represented the patron saint of his nation, St. George of England, and pleased himself with the reflection that the fief with which he had endowed Inglesant bore the name of the same saint. "You are il Cavaliere di San Giorgio," he said to his favourite, as he stood by his couch, sheathed in the superb but useless and fantastic armour of the 17th century, with cuirass, greaves, and cuisses of polished and jewelled metal, worn over the ordinary dress, and combined with the lace and velvet which ornamented the whole. It is true that the steel plates were covered with silver and gold chasing of arabesques, not of the most Christian type, and the perfect sword blade was engraved with hieroglyphics not of the most saintly kind. Nevertheless, Inglesant, as he stood, did certainly resemble somewhat closely a splendid Renaissance St. George. "You are il Cavaliere di San Giorgio," said the Duke, "and you must wear that armour when you go to meet your bride. I've arranged a train worthy of so illustrious a bridegroom." Inglesant's marriage had taken a great hold in the imagination of the dying man, and his mind, to the surprise of those who had known him longest, seemed to dwell entirely upon nuptials and festivals. The strain and terror which his spirit had suffered for so long had probably done their work, and like as on a harpsichord with a snapped string the set purpose and composure was lost, and nothing but fragments of fantasias could be played. That magic influence of the wonderful ducal palace, which Inglesant had been conscious of at his first visit, and of which the Duke had seemed hitherto altogether regardless, at the last moments of his life appeared to assert its power and force. And what to others seemed mere dotage appeared to Inglesant like a wintry gleam of mysterious light that might be the earnest of a happier time, a return from the dark regions of superstitious fear to the simple delights of common human life. The sway of this strange house was as powerful over Inglesant himself as it had been before, but he now stood upon higher ground than he had done formerly. The events which had occurred in the meantime had not been entirely without effect. His triumph over the temptation of the flesh in the forest pavilion had secured to him a higher place in the spiritual walk, and the escape from the assassin's dagger had sobered his spirit and indescribably touched his heart. The king's courts, of which this house was but a type, the Italian world in which he had lived so long, had therefore now less power than ever to crush Inglesant's religious instinct, but it gave it a certain colour, a sort of Renaissance Christianity which bore a likeness to the character of the art world in which it had grown up, a Christianity of florid ornament and of somewhat fantastic issues. As the Duke gradually became weaker and seemed every day to be on the point of death, he became the more anxious that Inglesant's marriage should be completed, and at last insisted upon his delaying his return to Rome no longer. Inglesant, who expected almost hour by hour the Duke's decease, would have been content to wait, but the dying man would take no denial. He pleased himself with giving orders for Inglesant's train, and ordered his favourite page, an Austrian boy, to accompany him, and to return immediately when the marriage was celebrated, that he might receive the fullest description of the particulars of the event. It was long before sunrise that Inglesant set out, accompanied by his train, hoping to cross the mountains before the heat began. His company consisted of several men-at-arms, with their grooms and horse-boys, and the Austrian page. They ascended the mountains in the earlier part of the night, and towards dawn they reached a flat plain. The night had been too dark to allow them to see the steep and narrow defiles full of oaks and beech, and as they passed over the dreary plain in the white mist, their figures seemed vast and indistinct in the dim light. But now, as the streaks of the dawn grew brighter in the east behind them, they could see the fir trees clothing the distant slopes, and here and there one of the higher summits still covered with white snow. The scene was cold and dead and dreary as the grave. A heavy mist hung over the mountain plain, and an icy lake lay black and cold beneath the morning sky. As they reached the crest of the hill, the mist rose, stirred by a little breeze at sunrise, and the gorges of the descent lay clear before them. The sun arose behind them, gilding the mountain tops and tracing streaks and shades of colour on the rising mist, sparkling with glittering dewdrops, while dark and solemn beneath them lay the pine-clothed ravines and sloping valleys with here and there a rocky peak, and farther down still the woods and hills gave place at last to the plain of the Tiber, at present dark and indistinguishable in the night. As the sun arose behind them, one by one the pine ravines became lighted, and the snowy summits, soft and pink with radiant light, stood out against the sky, which became every instant of a deeper blue. The sunlight stealing down the defiles and calling forth into distinct shape and vision tree and rock and flashing stream, spread itself over the oak woods in the valleys, and shone at last upon the plain, embossed and radiant with wood and green meadow and marble towers and glistering water, the waters of the Tiber running onwards towards Rome. Mysterious forms and waves of light, the creatures of the morning and of the mist, floated before the sight, and from the dark fir trees murmurs and mutterings of ethereal life fell upon the ear. Sudden and passionate flushes of colour tinted the pine woods and were gone, and beneath the branches and across the paths fairy lights played for a moment and passed away. The party halted more than once, but it was necessary to make the long descent before the heat began, and they commenced carefully to pick their way down the stony mountain road, which wound down the ravines in wild unequal paths. The track, now precipitous, now almost level, took them round corners and masses of rock, sometimes hanging above their heads, revealing continually new reaches of valley and new defiles clothed with fir and oak. Mountain flowers and trailing ivy and creeping plants hung in festoons on every side. Lizards ran across the path. Birds fluttered above them or darted into the dark recesses where the mountain brooks were heard. Everything sang the morning psalm of life, with which from field and mountain solitudes the free children of nature salute the day. The Austrian boy felt the beauty of the scene and broke out into singing. When the northern gods, he said to Inglesant, rode on their chevisance, they went down into the deep valleys singing magic songs. Let us into the dark valley singing magic songs also go down. Who knows what strange and hidden deities, since the old pagan times lost and forgotten, we may find among the dark fir dingles and the laurel shades. And he began to sing some love ditty. Inglesant did not hear him. The beauty of the scene, ethereal and unreal in its loveliness, following upon the long, dark mountain ride, his sleepless nights and strange familiarity with approaching death by the couch of the old duke, confused his senses, and a presentiment of impending fate filled his mind. The recollection of his brother rose again in his remembrance, distinct and present as in life, and more than once he fancied that he heard his voice as the cry of some mountain beast or sound of moaning trees came up the pass. No other foreshadowing than this very imperfect one warned him of the approaching crisis of his life. The sun was fully up, and the light already brilliant and intense, when they approached a projecting point where the slope of wood ended in a tower of rock jutting upon the road. The path by which they approached it was narrow and ragged, but beyond the rock the ground spread itself out, and the path was carried inward towards the right, having the sloping hillside on the one hand covered with scattered oaks, while on the other a slip of ground separated it from the ravine. At the turning of the road where the opening valley lay before them, as they reached the corner. Face to face with Inglesant as he checked his horse was the Italian, the inquisitive stranger of the theatre at Florence, the intruder into the conclave, the mask of the carnival ball, the assassin of the Corso, that Malvolti who had treacherously murdered his brother and sought his own life. Alone and weary, his clothes worn and threadbare, he came toiling up the pass. Inglesant reined in his horse suddenly, a strange and fierce light in his eyes and face. The Italian started back like some wild creature of the forest brought suddenly to bay. A terrified cry broke from him, and he looked wildly round, as if intending flight. The nature of the ground caught him as in a trap. On the one hand, the sloping hillside, steep and open; on the other, tangled, rugged ground, slightly rising between the road and the precipice, cut off all hope of sudden flight. He looked wildly round for a moment, then when the horsemen came round the rocky wall and halted behind their leader, his eyes came back to Inglesant's face, and he marked the smile upon his lips and in his eyes, and saw his hand steal downwards to the hunting piece he carried at the saddle. Then with a terrible cry he threw himself on his knees before the horse's head and begged for pity, pity and life. Inglesant took his hand from his weapon, and turning slightly to the page and to the others behind him, he said, "This man, Messereri, is a murderer and a villain, steeped in every crime, a cruel, secret, midnight cutthroat and assassin, a lurker in secret corners to murder the innocent. He took my brother, a noble gentleman whom I was proud to follow, treacherously at an advantage, and slew him. I see him now before me, lying in his blood. He tried to take my life, I who scarcely even knew him, in the streets of Rome. Now he begs for mercy. What say you, gentlemen? What is his due? Shoot the dog through the head, hang him on the nearest tree, carry him into Rome, and torture him to death." The Italian still continued on his knees, his hands clasped before him, his face working with terror and agony that could not be disguised. "Mercy, Monseigneur," he cried, "mercy! I cannot, I dare not, I'm not fit to die. For the blessed host, Monseigneur, have mercy, for the love of Jesu, for the sake of Jesu." As he said these last words, Inglesant's attitude altered, and the cruel light faded out of his eyes. His hand ceased to finger the carabine at his saddle, and he sat still upon his horse, looking down upon the abject wretch before him, while a man might count 50. The Italian saw, or thought he saw, that his judge was inclining to mercy, and he renewed his appeals for pity. "For the love of the crucifix, Monseigneur, for the Blessed Virgin's sake." But Inglesant did not seem to hear him. He turned to the horsemen behind him and said, "Take him up, one of you, on the crupper. Search him first for arms. Another keep his eye on him, and if he moves or attempts to escape, shoot him dead. You had better come quietly," he continued. "It is your only chance for life." Two of the men-at-arms dismounted and searched the prisoner, but found no arms upon him. He seemed, indeed, to be in the greatest distress from hunger and want, and his clothes were ragged and thin. He was mounted behind one of the soldiers and closely watched, but he made no attempt to escape, and indeed appeared to have no strength or energy for such an effort. They went on down the pass for about an Italian league. The country became more thickly wooded, and here and there on the hillsides patches of corn appeared, and once or twice in the sheltered spot a few vines. At length, on the broad shoulder of the hill round which the path wound, they saw before them a few cottages, and above them, on the hillside, in a position that commanded the distant pass till it opened on the plain, was a chapel, the bell of which had just ceased ringing for mass. Inglesant turned his horse's head up the narrow stony path, and when the gate was reached he dismounted and entered the chapel, followed by his train. The capella had apparently been built of the remains of some temple or old Roman house, for many of the stones of the front were carved in bold relief. It was a small, narrow building, and possessed no furniture save the altar and a rude pulpit built of stones, but behind the altar, painted on the plaster of the wall, was the rude crucifix the size of life. Who the artist had been cannot now be told. It might have been the pupil of some great master who had caught something of the master's skill, or perhaps in the old time some artist had come up the pass from Bergo San Sepolcro and had painted it for the love of his art and of the Blessed Virgin. But whoever had done it, it was well done, and it gave a sanctity to the little chapel, and possessed an influence of which the villagers were not unconscious, and of which they were even proud. The mass had commenced some short time as the train entered, and such few women and peasants as were present turned in surprise. Inglesant knelt upon the steps before the altar, and the men-at-arms upon the floor of the chapel, the two who guarded the prisoner keeping close behind their leader. The priest, who was an old and simple-looking countryman, continued his office without stopping, but when he had received the sacred elements himself, he turned, and influenced probably by his appearance and by his position at the altar, he offered Inglesant the sacrament. He took it, and the priest, turning again to the altar, finished the mass. Then Inglesant rose, and when the priest turned again, he was standing before the altar with his drawn sword held lengthwise across his hands. "My father," he said, "I am the Cavaliere di San Giorgio, and as I came across the mountains this morning on my way to Rome, I met my mortal foe, the murderer of my brother, a wretch whose life is forfeit by every law, either of earth or of heaven, a guilty monster steeped in every crime. Him, as soon as I had met him, sent by this lonely and untrodden way, as it seems to me by the Lord's hand, I thought to crush at once, as I would a venomous beast, though he is worse than any beast. But my father, he has appealed from me to the adorable name of Jesus, and I cannot touch him. But he will not escape. I give him over to the Lord. I give up my sword into the Lord's hands, that he may work my vengeance upon him, as it seems to him good. Henceforth he is safe from earthly retribution, but the divine powers are just. Take this sword, reverend father, and let it lie upon the altar beneath the Christ himself, and I will make an offering for daily masses for my brother's soul." The priest took the sword, and kneeling before the altar, placed it thereon, like a man acting in a dream. He was one of those childlike peasant priests to whom the great world was unknown, and to whom his mountain solitudes were peopled as much by the saints and angels of his breviary as by the peasants who shared with him the solitudes and the legends that gave to these mountain fastnesses a mysterious awe. To such a man as this it seemed nothing strange that the blessed St. George himself, in jewelled armour, should stand before the altar in the mystic morning light, his shining sword in his hand. He turned again to Inglesant, who had knelt down once more. "It is well done, Monseigneur," he said, "as all that thou doest doubtless is most well. The sword shall remain here, as thou sayest, and the Lord doubtless will work his blessed will. But I entreat, Monseigneur, thy intercession for me, a poor sinful man, and when thou returnest to thy place and seest again the Lord Jesus, that thou wilt remind him of his unworthy priest. Amen." Inglesant scarcely heard what he said, and certainly did not understand it. His sense was confused by what had happened, and by the sudden overmastering impulse upon which he had acted. He moved as in a dream. Nothing seemed to come strange to him, nothing startled him, and he took slight heed of what passed. He placed his embroidered purse, heavy with gold, in the priest's hand, and in his excitement totally forgot to name his brother, for whose repose masses were to be said. He signed to his men to release the prisoner, and his trumpets sounding too hoarse before the chapel gate, he mounted and rode on down the pass. But his visit was not forgotten, and long afterwards, perhaps even to the present day, popular tradition took the story up, and related that once, when the priest of the mountain chapel was a very holy man, the blessed St. George himself, in shining armour, came across the mountains one morning very early, and himself partook of the sacrament, and all his train, and appealed triumphantly to the magic sword, set with gold and precious stones, that lay upon the altar from that morning, by virtue of which no harm can befall the village, no storm strike it, and above all, no pillage of armed men or any violence can occur. The Austrian boy returned to Umbria with his story of the marriage, but the old Duke never heard it. No sooner had Inglesant left him than his depression and despair returned. He loathed the sight of the day and of the costly palace in which he lived. The gay arts and the devised fancies by which men had sought to lure happiness became intolerable to him, and ill as he was, he caused himself to be removed to the Castle Durante, amid the lonely mountain ravines, to abide his end. As Inglesant bowed beneath the cerecloth, the fine linen cloth laid over the newly married in the church, kneeling till mass was ended, with his heart full of love and brightness and peace, the last of the house of Revere, worn out, says the chronicler, with a burst of unusual candour, by priestly torments, breathed his last, and went to another world, where, it may be hoped, sacrifice and devotion are better rewarded than they are here, and superstitious terrors are unknown. Section 50.